For our forums, as you know, has been the same year after year. The world we want. We used it the first year, and then when we came to change it the second year, somebody said, well, why don't you keep on talking about the world we want until we begin to think we're getting it? And so that's why for the 9 years we've kept that theme, the world we want. And that is the theme now of a discussion in which 6 other delegates will take part. They are Ramon Cruz Jr. from the Philippines, Leslie Scholes from Australia, Sabine Ewald from France, George Kochetkov from Yugoslavia, Samuel Laxman Fernando from Ceylon, and Paolo Filippini from Italy. This is the first year, by the way, that we've had a delegate from Yugoslavia. Discussion of the world we want starts with a word from Leslie Scholes of Australia.
You know, whenever this forum group gets together, we have new stories to tell each other about the questions Americans ask. Does everyone in Ceylon have a pet elephant? Do Pakistani women still wear chiffon pants and live in harems? Are the Filipinos heart and soul for statehood? But now that we're going back to our own schools where we'll be answering questions, we've just had a horrid thought. No one will believe us that all New Yorkers are not millionaires, and that we haven't seen a single cowboy on the streets of Manhattan. And Usha from India says she's had a hard time realizing that American people have problems too, just like other people. Conclusion, there is no monopoly on international ignorance. However, I would like to take this opportunity of telling you that there's other things in Australia besides kangaroos and tennis players. And do you know that Australia is actually bigger than the United States? It only appears larger on your maps because Americans make them. It was a shock to me to come over here during my summer vacation and to find the dreary cold weather and to have to go to school. I don't know how you can stand having Christmas in the wintertime when every sensible person knows it should be summertime then. However, apart from these things, I think you American people are wonderful. You're just like Australians. With one exception, perhaps. You are even more eager to hear criticisms of yourselves. And this is rather surprising, since most foreigners think of Americans as braggarts who do not think there is anything other countries have which America doesn't have also.
I can't agree with you, Leslie. It is true that we have all been asked hundreds of times, how do you like America? But you are wrong if you think this is an invitation to us to express our criticism. On the contrary, it is a plea to us to show admiration for this wonderful country. Therefore, the only correct answer is, I love it. Americans can tolerate a severe criticism of their institutions. When you came here, we were reminded that different is not a synonym for worse. A subtle way of saying that criticism is not welcome here. I am not blaming anybody for not liking criticism. I myself couldn't stand to have someone point out my defects. But why do people encourage us to criticize if they can't accept our criticism?
I hasten to encourage you, Paolo. What else would you like to get off your chest?
Well, Americans lack sophistication. To acquire sophistication, you have to depart from a group and be individuals. American students are too much involved in group activities to gain the discernment of individuals. When you grow up, you know pretty well how to work together, but your brains haven't got any subtlety. 2 reasons seem to account for this. First, schools judge a student's capacity by his personal record of extracurricular activities. Second, there is actually a fear of not knowing how to spend one's free time. Americans are always looking for pastimes. They are tremendously afraid of boredom. And to avoid it, they keep themselves on the move all the time. In doing so, they deny themselves the pleasure of having a refuge in which recover spiritual energy from the tiring daily routine. They kill the most precious kind of freedom man has ever been given, the freedom to have privacy.
Wait a minute, Paolo. At the risk of offending you with personal criticism, which you admit you can't stand, didn't you just contradict yourself a moment ago? You said the Americans aren't subtle, but you also criticized the subtle implication of the warning that different is not a synonym for worse.
Okay, so I'll tell you about a personal experience which makes me contradict myself again. I have a girlfriend waiting for me at home. At least I hope so. I wanted to find her a present, something typical of America. My host offered to help me. He stepped boldly into a shop and told the saleswoman the whole story about me, my girlfriend, and the thing I needed. This frankness surprised me. I would never share my privacy with the first person I meet. Anyway, I acknowledge that the most simple way of getting what I wanted was to do what my host actually did. That's why I like America. You Americans. In your practical simplicity, you've got a spiritual soundness. So I end up with self-criticism. It is almost unbelievable, the power of assimilation of this country. I am 50% Americanized already.
As we were saying before we were interrupted, Americans are very keen of hearing criticism about their country. There are many reasons, I think. Here, the search for a better life is never ending. The sum total of American energy seems to be concentrated on improving something, anything from other people's opinions of them to ever bigger cars. An American friend of mine once spoke disparagingly of British cars, which he called biscuit tins. He said that you don't get into a British car, but you put it on. You see, these big cars that you build create a big problem. I know of many people who own 2 or 3 cars, but still prefer to use the subway.
I've got another example of how you improve things so much that you sometimes overdo it. You take so much of the food value out of bread to make it pure white that then you have to go back and make it protein enriched.
Speaking of proteins, I got so scared once when I heard one of my American mothers preparing the menu. She was not planning to give us food at all, but chemicals. I heard her say, tonight we'll have 2 proteins, or 1 carbohydrate and some roughage. But I must say, it looked normal and tasted delicious.
Leslie, I'd like to ask you a question. Australia, like America, is a new country, built out of a wilderness by immigrants. Do you have anything comparable to this something called Americanism? Australianism, perhaps?
No, at least discussion of the Australian way of life isn't as evident as Americanism is here. Perhaps it's because most people came from the British Isles.
Not the British Empire, as every Asian knows. Leslie, I want to ask you a question. Is it true that a few weeks ago, an Australian Airlines bus in Singapore carried the sign, "We cater for Europeans only"?
Now that the European colonial power have either left Asia or been obliged to leave, I thought the idea of white supremacy had left too, hasn't it?
Well, one evidence in the Philippines is that a degree from an American university carries greater prestige than a degree from a Philippine university.
But Junior, I feel that there is something far more basic than that. The years of colonialism in our countries have created a sense of inferiority in us. We feel that our cultures have been neglected, and I feel that there is one vast reaction against it. We not only want to regain our past glories, but we also want to deal with the rest of the world on an equal basis. Now, in order to do this, however, we need assistance from foreign countries. The biggest problem today is how to attain this cooperation between East and West without any infringement on our newly acquired freedom.
Is the failure of your rubber deal with the United States an illustration of what you mean, Sam?
Oh yes, I think that is a very dramatic example. You see, we had been selling rubber to the United States. Suddenly, when the Korean War ended, the United States stopped buying our rubber. We sell our rubber in order to buy our rice so that we may not starve. We usually get our rice from Burma, but the rice crop in Burma failed that year. England appealed to Thailand on our behalf, but they were holding their rice supplies for a rise in price. But unfortunately, their stocks rotted in their storehouses. Our last hope was the United States, but we could not buy your rice at your price unless you bought our rubber at our price. But you refused, and what happened? You know, when people are hungry, they have to eat. So we formed a trade pact with Red China, and immediately the United States stopped economic aid to Ceylon. And in 1953, Ceylon became Red China's most important free world trade partner.
Well, but of course, one law enforced at that time the Battle Act, which controlled the American relations with those countries that sent strategic materials to communist countries, left Congress no other choice. But can't you just see the headlines? These Asians must be communists since they trade with Red China.
Yes, but Junior, this attitude must change, must necessarily change. Immediately after the war, the Asian countries were almost begging for American economic assistance. We still need it, but there are beginning to be alternatives. The mutual assistance idea, so successfully developed by the Colombo Plan, is just one example. Here, the member nations do not suspect each other's motives. As a citizen of a country that is directly involved in this plan, I can speak for the steady progress we are making. The case of the steel mill that Russia is building in India suggests yet another alternative. Instead of standing hat in hand, begging from the United States as our only hope, we may find the communists and the Americans trying to compete with each other to give us aid.
But Sam, are you depending only on the aid that others give you?
Oh no, far from it. I feel that only 10% of our problems could be solved by this foreign economic aid. The Asians themselves must bear the greatest burden. Self-help is the best help, we say. We must awaken to our responsibilities, and instead of decrying Western imperialism, we ourselves must do something tangible to improve our lot. Of course, we need foreign aid. You can help us in this way. Instead of doling out dollars, you can help us by training our people in highly scientific fields, in fields such as technology and mineralogy. You can buy our produce. You can invest in our natural resources, and most of all, ensure a safe market for us. I feel that peoples of Asia, if they are to improve their lot, must realize their responsibilities as citizens of their respective countries. By patriotism, I mean we must be patriotic in our countries. By patriotism, I do not mean narrow-minded nationalism, but I mean that love for one's country, whereby every individual realizes his obligations to his community. In this respect, I think we can take a great lesson from the United States. What has most impressed me during my stay here is that splendid cooperation between people of various walks of life. Millions of Asia today need that feeling that you have, that every individual has some share in his destiny.
Well, Sam, I think you made a very good point. In Manila, we had the a drive which we called Operation Brotherhood, and in it we solicited clothes and food and soap, towels for the refugees in Vietnam, and also we sent a corps of doctors and nurses to Vietnam. I think that this is a very dramatic example now of Haitians helping Asians. And anyone born in Asia knows that not all solutions are black and white. Asia is far more complicated than Europe, with far more races, religions, languages, and cultures. In my country alone, which is smaller than the British Isles, we have 7,000 islands, 87 dialects, and as to culture, we have Negrito, Indonesian, Malayan, Chinese, Spanish, and later American.
But in spite of all these complexities and differences, there is one thing that all Asians feel in common today. We have all been exploited by the white man, and we are united in our effort to keep ourselves free of him and to improve our own things by our own selves. And in my opinion, this is the sole purpose of the Bandung Conference.
I hope this Asian conference will be more successful than the movement for unification of Western Europe. I'm European, and of course I would like to see a strong and progressive Europe, but united as a whole. I'm against the unification of only one part, Europe, because this would mean the division of Europe into blocks, and this would make the Cold War worse.
I don't agree with you, George. I think a way to prevent a third world war is for Western Europe to unite and be so strong that there will be no chance for single countries to be picked off one by one. Maybe you don't realize how much we've done already, how much France has done. The cold steel pool is a French idea, and it is working.
But wasn't it France that killed the EDC, the European Defence Community? I don't know how you can have any policy when you haven't a government half the time.
That is what the people always say. But you don't realize that the work of the government still goes on. You see, we just do it differently. In the British Empire, the prime ministers often changes the ministers. In France, the ministers often change the prime minister.
But Leslie, I think the killing of EDC is a good proof that these military alliances are not the way to solve problems. For instance, NATO has some ideological purposes, namely to fight against the communism. That's unacceptable for Yugoslavia and for some other countries in Europe. Besides, we would like to be identified with all European countries in the organizations for mutual cooperation. If European countries, all European countries, adopt a policy of active coexistence based on the foundations opposed to Cold War, all European problems will be solved.
Again, George, I don't agree with your first point. The NATO is not planned to fight communism. It is planned to be a defense against any aggression. This purpose is very different.
Okay, we don't agree on this, NATO, but we have to agree that we are both Europeans. And really, for the first time since I have been here, I've got feeling that I'm not only a Yugoslav, but also a European.
That has happened to me, too. Before I came here, I had never thought of politics at all, really, or the fact that I was European as well as French. You see, the French children never learn in school about current problems. I started only this year in my history class to learn about the 20th century. Right now, we must be up to the First World War, because last December, when I left France, we were starting 1870. Since Europe is already too small in the big world to be able to afford to be divided into small countries more or less fighting against each other. Since a very long time, people have thought of uniting Europe, but have never found the right way to succeed. The last two ones who tried and failed were Napoleon and Hitler. This is to show that it is not force that should be used.
Well, my point, exactly.
This forum shows what should be done intensively all over the world. Make the youngsters meet. I don't think we can do anything with grown-ups. Grown-ups in France and Germany still fear each other. But when Sabine from Germany and I think of those past 3 wars, we have troubles understanding why they ever happened. I certainly do not fear her.
I agree with Sabine that the main hope for European unity lies with the young people, but we mustn't wait until we grow up. For instance, in Yugoslavia, we are already doing quite a lot with the international camps for the young people all over the world who come together, as we have here.
Sabine, I want to come back to that subject of fear you just mentioned. I have been struck by the amount of fear there is among American young people today. Fear of communism, fear of a Third World War.
Yes. Before I came here, I thought that the United States would be the safest place to be during a war. After all, war has never come here. So, naturally, I thought Americans to be less disturbed by the idea of war than Asians are. But the contrary seems to be true. It seems to me that Americans are the most pessimistic people in the world today.
I was frankly horrified by the number of air raid signs in public buildings and the air raid drills in your schools. And the air raids and the signs on the side of the road saying, this road will be closed to civilian traffic in the event of an enemy attack.
I can understand. I know that we should be prepared in a case of a new war. But when we talk about war every day, people are getting too afraid. And also when you think about war, you don't think enough about the alternatives to war.
I'm inclined to think that effective opposition to communism ought to be based on a deep and thorough understanding of what communism is, rather than blind hatred of it based on fear. In one of the schools I visited, the teacher told me she had to teach everything mentioning communism in terms of black and white. Otherwise, someone in the community might say she was a communist.
Maybe, Leslie, that's not quite as bad as you think. After all, I come from Yugoslavia, but every American I have met in my stay here has been very friendly to me, and many of them have changed the ideas about new Yugoslavia. And but nobody prevented me of talking. Even more, they asked me to talk, so that I have been talking 6, 7 or more times every day, and people have understood me.
And it is a queer fact, but a true one, that competition with communism can cause us to perfect our democracy. For instance, in the Philippines, the land situation has always concentrated wealth in a few men and left millions in poverty. Quick to take advantage of the setup, the communists attracted people to their armed movement by decrying the unjust distribution of land. But their cries in turn prompted the government to practice more democracy by providing free land for the landless. As to the communists, we found a very effective way of converting them. We turned them into capitalists by also giving them land. In the world, the same thing is happening. The communists have brought about a great awakening. An awakening to the fact that democracy is not functioning as it should be. The communists, in trying to win more allies in Asia, have attacked Western imperialism, and in this way helped Asians realize their lack of sovereignty, which was in reality a lack of democracy. Now Asians are responding to the Communist Herald, not by joining the communists themselves, but by crying for more freedom, more self-government, more democracy. Now Asians are more democracy-minded, and help is coming to Asia from the free world, no longer as charity to poor relations, but because free men know that they must extend their area of freedom, among other reasons, to keep their own.
There is another problem too, the atom. Instead of using it, we are afraid of it. It would be very funny if it wasn't so tragic. You are spending a lot of money to get something what will destroy us in any case if we use it. If we really want peace, our policy has to be based on foundations opposed to Cold War. Here comes active coexistence. This demands cooperation with all countries, regardless of differences in political structure and social order. We should understand that these differences are the result of internal development, and they are unavoidable at the present level of international relations. They are an internal matter of individual countries, and other countries have no right to interfere in them. Cooperation has to be on the basis of equality, because if there is no equality, there is domination and not coexistence. These principles are in the full harmony with general conceptions of the United Nations Charter.
I'm tired of war. I don't want to hear that word anymore. I'm scared. Why should people always fight when it is so easy to be friends? Just watch our group. If there's a war in Formosa, it's going to be the most silly thing. I thought we had the UN now to prevent silly fighting. I wish the Big Four would meet in a room and do what we did in Washington when we changed the rules. When you have to represent the other person's point of view, you understand it much better. I think it is very important in life to have many friends. Now, I'm going home with more friends than I ever had in my life. I had never thought before that other countries were made up with young people like me. Now I shall always remember. My heart is full of love and happiness I want to share with all the boys and girls in the world. Vive le monde!
Long live the world. Vive le monde, Sabine. We all agree with you.